this topic today is linked to an article that we've published in our newsletter. I'll make sure when we send the follow-on link to the YouTube that we'll send a link to the article. And, this is the headline. Beyond the first step, unintended consequences into supply chain decision-making. And, really, I thought a lot about this because this has been something that I've experienced in my career, and it's very timely given the magnitude of short-term decisions that people are having to make right now in their supply chain. So thank you for signing up, whether you're here live with us or you're listening after they're watching after the fact. We welcome your feedback as always. Are we hitting the mark with these discussions? So what I want to do today is kind of dive into this idea, and we're going to talk a little bit about why it happens, but we're going to talk mostly about you and your role in these processes, whether you are a senior person or a junior person, whether you can add, how you can add some steps that are not huge lifts to be able to mitigate this. So, the idea behind this is when you're working on these big decisions, and in the article we say strategic decisions, but it's a lot of decisions that we deal with in the field of supply chain. And truthfully, they're decisions that are, at large in commerce and in policy as well as supply chains. And the reality is when we're working on those big decisions, they get the focus, right? That's the immediate, both whether it's the problem or the opportunity. And the truth is leaders and those involved in driving to that decision, it's a lot of work to do the analysis, to make the recommendation, to even go forward and do X. And the reality is, that time constraint, resources are always tight when you're looking at these decisions. So time and resource constraint, it's very easy to miss these other things. And we generally at the Supply Chain Logistics Institute are really trying to help people make higher quality decisions, right? So let's not miss these things that can happen to us. And this idea of second order consequences, they happen, long after the big presentation, because everyone's always relieved when you come out of that big meeting where whoever the decision maker is, head of a business unit, head of a function, head of a company. I've presented to the chairman of the Coca-Cola company. It's a big relief when you come out of those big presentations, you get the thumbs up. Let's go forward. Let's go do this. And in some cases, you can let your guard down. And what we want to make sure is that you can be 2 steps ahead. You can do the diligence to make sure that these second order unintended consequences are at least understood to a degree before the big decision is made. Okay, so that's the idea. Again, from my perspective, I've seen many times when speed was the priority. Okay, it's like, we've got to get this done, whether it was a constraint for capital budgeting, whether it was a new product that required new infrastructure, whether it was a large, software project. We've got to get this TMS implemented. And I did one of those and we missed some stuff there. So all of those things, that whole idea is that the process values pace versus being reflective about it. Okay. And I think the whole concept, and this is true, particularly when you're dealing with like an acquisition, done some of this in the M&A side. It's like, hey man, let's get the deal done. Right. And we might go through due diligence, but the due diligence is less about what could go wrong and more about, what are we buying here? And is the valuation appropriate? Right. And I think, in many cases, it is time and other things, but in some cases, you don't want to be part of the no police, right? When you want to say, I want to poke holes in this. And people say, why do you want to poke holes in this? We want to get this done. As opposed to saying, I want to be a responsible member of the team and make sure the interests of the company, share owners, privately owned company, the literal owners, as well as our customers, consumers, and in many cases, suppliers, because these second order impacts can cascade to all kinds of stakeholders. So I think there are clearly challenges in this. These things are complex. Okay. Um, these are, again, I said strategic decisions, but this applies to a lot. Most of the decisions we're faced with now are not, one, two, three, let's go. There's just a lot at stake and there's a lot involved. And again, when we're trying to get there, we're trying to get to a recommendation and get to yes, not being robust and looking at it. And I do think, you know, we are making these decisions now. We clearly know that the outcome of these decisions will be what we have to take advantage of or live with in the future. But it's very hard for us to live in that future because we're consumed living in today's world. So it's that, it's that future you that we want to leverage when we think through this. And we have a convenient view that things can be undone. But the truth is, in commerce, most of these larger decisions are either impossible to undo or very, very difficult and very expensive. In many cases, a lot of the technology things are like one-way streets. And I think the other thing we have to be careful is, you do one thing, you can create two problems that somebody else, whether you're sticking around or not, somebody else is going to have to deal with. So I think that's what we want to think about. And what I do want to make the case is this is not about bad people. This isn't about bad judgment. It's about processes that don't enable us or ask us to explore what could go wrong. Who else might be impacted by this that we hadn't thought about, and how the decision will work if our assumptions aren't exactly right. I was with a supplier of a very large company, and it's a very highly aligned supplier, and their customer was and is making very aggressive decisions around their sourcing strategy. And I don't mean supplier sourcing, I mean deployment sort. Where are they fulfilling orders from? And they're moving things around. And in many cases, they're moving things from a supplier's infrastructure into their own infrastructure. And it makes perfect sense in terms of what they're trying to do for the consumer, but they're descaling suppliers. And all the supplier says is, how do we get some lead time in this? We support the customer, but if we're going to get descaled, we need time in order to be able to manage our own infrastructure and workforce to be supportive of this. So how do you get those things served up? I could give you lots of real world examples. I'll be sensitive because I don't want to, out anybody. So these are kind of a few that are, that we talked about in the article. They definitely are analogous to things that I've dealt with. The truth is, and we'll talk about a plant closure that's hypothetical in our example, but I've definitely been involved in plant closures. I can go back to companies that don't exist anymore, so I can kind of comment on it, where we made assumptions about growth. We made assumptions around the capability of the remaining facilities, and we pulled the trigger and we closed a plant. And then after the fact, we saw a couple things. The plant, or plants in plural, that were to take on that volume really weren't ready for it. And what we found over time, and so that created immediate problems because you couldn't digest it. In some cases, we had to delay the closure of a plant. Some cases, a lot of extra cost to source from other locations. But in the longer term horizon, what we found was we had assumptions on where certain categories were going to go that were not accurate, right? And so long-term consumption trends changed, and at some point somebody said, gosh, I sure wish we had that plant back, right? So that's a big deal, that, and that's very real. You can see it now with the reshoring that's going on. I mean, there are lots of pressures on this for people to move fast. And in some cases you can accomplish, the physical supply chain move, but they're just issues that arise that, that become much more challenging, right? Whether you move something from Asia and you've moved it into Mexico, you move from, in some cases, a pretty straightforward process of ocean movement. And now you've got to deal with land transport in Mexico and border crossing and transload and that type of thing. It's a whole new set of logistics skills that you better make sure you've got the muscle before. So there are plenty of examples that that I think we can point to. So I don't want to belabor that point, but it's all over the place. Okay. So I've mentioned to most of these, but you're going to get these objections, and I think there's two things I really want to address here. Two or three things. People will say we don't have time. These are hypotheticals, right? And I'm like, they are, but one of these hypotheticals will be the actual future. And I think the bias to simplicity is it's hard, and you shouldn't simplify very complex, decisions that could have a material impact on a company's business. And maybe that's the card you play for people who, are accountable for material changes to a business. And then I think when people talk about all of this, hypothetical future scenario work around what we could be up against, someone will say, that's not the scope of this. The scope of this is to make the decision. Well, we would say it's not about great decisions. It's a great outcomes of decisions that, that we really ought to be focused on. So, for us, this is not a side job. This is what happens. And almost all of these decisions really, really can come back to haunt us. And I think, I haven't mentioned as much on the software side of this, but, there are plenty of stats, and we all have been part of these where, the software implementations that are going to go, very smoothly, they just don't. I mean, you can get the statistics, 80-90% of these that have some pain point. They cost you in customer experience. In many cases, they cost you in lost sales. And in many cases, it's not about that the technology was not the right technology, didn't have all the capabilities. In many cases, it's not even some of the traditional issues we see in software implementations in terms of data, process alignment. It's that there's cross-functional impact or integrations to other systems that weren't fully understood, and they don't work as planned. In many cases, you're pressed on testing time, and you end up, with pain and heartache. Okay. So I think, again, this is not about bad faith. This is not about bad people. This is just people are overloaded. And, for me, these second order effects are like flying a plane without looking at the weather, right? You'll get off the ground, but you might not land where you planned. Okay. So I think when we think about it in the supply chain, I did talk about network redesign as a big one, open and close plants. Changing suppliers is a big deal. And many of us have been involved. We have dear friends, some of us on the phone are probably in procurement. Those folks are the ones who solve P&L challenges by driving better supplier choices that allow us to have lower cost of input. But the truth is, a lot of those exercises are definitely overly focused on cost. And we've tried hard over the years to balance resilience in those decisions. But even if we've made a choice to a supplier who is in fact able to hit our spec, able to provide capacity, but their network may have more challenging transportation lanes than an existing network, and we've got to get either there or our carriers used to it. There can be all kinds of ripple effects from bringing that new supplier in that weren't thought about because we were biased to a certain part of the KPI scheme when we were making that decision. And then I commented on technology change. That's I myself have been part of a TMS and a WMS. In the TMS, we went from a third party managed transportation who had great tools, including a lot of great data analytics well before those were common. We bought a very leading TMS. I won't say who it is. And a lot of the dialogue from the salespeople that we talked to was, you're going to get great analytics out of this. And we went and did that, and shame on us. We didn't look deep enough and wasn't necessarily what we expected out of the box. And we lost a lot of visibility that way. And I've also been part of a WMS implementation that I personally had to recommend to a head of a business unit that we had to turn it off. And that was a very unpopular decision for me. Ironically, the business unit lead was super supportive because we were able to impact or mimic or limit the impact to customers. And we were able to rework that with employees so we didn't get the employees sideways. And we came back. The funny thing is, he had me tell this story like 5 times to kind of show how important it was to bring these issues to the table. And I think our learning was many of these things could have been known ahead of time in both of those examples. So now let's talk and spend more time like, so what do you do about this? And I think I've made the case in some of our social media and in the article that if you really want to, you can go through these tools with the right group of people in an afternoon. So when you get the objection for people to say, we don't have time for this, I'm going to say, you give us an afternoon, we can highlight some things that we should talk about. And it's probably an afternoon to execute the tools and maybe time in a PMO or a project meeting to go through them. Okay, so maybe an afternoon plus an hour or two in front of the right decision folks. So these are simple tools. We're not asking you to change your process, just be a bit more intentional about hiding these. And then, my belief is these are clear examples. When I say we want higher decision quality, we can talk about, and I do believe in advanced analytics and AI and that type of thing, but these practical tools that are old school analog kind of tools can help improve your decision quality because we're trying to do it ahead of time. We're not trying to say no to the decision. We're not even trying to say change the decision, but we might be saying there's pre-work to be done. There are things that we have to invest in to mitigate the issue. So this is the first one. Makes pretty much sense. We've all been involved in postmortems. Nobody likes to do them because if it's going well, what's the point? And if it hasn't gone well, you're in the midst of the kind of the food fight. And this is kind of the idea that we kind of go forward and say, it's 18 months from now. This thing didn't go well. What happened? What was going on? Let the team think about, things that could happen, right? So you're doing this, qualitative side of things, using that side of the brain, that's more abstract, that says, what are all the things that could go wrong? It's a safe environment. I like to do this before the last minute. So people can basically, say this could happen, right? And the whole idea here is we get some blind spots kind of served up and say, I'm not sure that we've really thought about that. Okay. So nothing crazy. And we'll kind of use an example of this in a little bit. The second one for us is this idea of ripple mapping. And this is not necessarily a tool that I've used a lot, but when we've looked at, at the research on this is not hard to do, but it is the layers of the onion here. Okay. So, in that first order, what is directly going to happen, right, to the people who are immediately in the midst of this scope of our supply chain? What is going to happen to them? But then what's going to happen at the layer beyond that? That may be further people in the same company, right? Our company, but it might start to be third parties we work with, right? If you're in a supply chain, an extended supply chain. And then when you get into the third order, then you should be talking about your customer. You should be talking about at least your tier one supplier. And then you want to get a sense of, who's winning in this move and who's got new risks, right? And that is a great way to kind of get your cross-functional teams involved. So everyone can kind of have more of a business lens to this. Okay. So again, nothing earth-shattering here. And in my view, the right group of people, in each of these so far, it's probably less than 10 people. It might even be in that 5 to 7. So it's not a massive group. If it's the right group with the right perspectives and the right experience, you can also team these, right? Get 3 or 4 small teams together in a workshop kind of setting and just work through it and have the teams come back together, whether they're looking at different aspects of the problem where you actually want them to each look at the same problem and come back. And I would tell you, in some of the stuff we've done lately, we've done these really fast and just ask people in 10, 15, 20 minutes to come back in and out. And it also can work virtually if you're not all physically in the same place. Okay. Next one is kind of a classic for me. When we first got involved in Lean Six Sigma, when we were at Coke, we had a lot of the ex-auto folks who were very big on error proofing, and there are many tools for that. But for me, the FMEA is something we now use in every project that I've been involved in the last few years. And I can tell you, I can do an FMEA in an hour, and I can actually do a ChatGPT FMEA in minutes. And I've done them and then sent them to folks who work at some of the companies involved, and they're like, you know what? It's like 80% accurate, right? So it's enough to get things moving. The idea here is we say, what are all the things that could go wrong? Okay. What could happen, right? How could the decision or the plan fail us in whatever way could happen? And the way we think about this is kind of a scoring of it, right? You have three different metrics. You score them 1 to 10. 10 is bad, 0 is good. For the purposes of most of what we're doing, you put a 1 in, but if you've got something that's a 1-1-1, you're not worried about it. But the 10-10-10s or the 9-8-9s are the ones you're really worried about. And the first thing is, if this happened, how bad would it be? Okay. So that's the first thing. We're out of business. It's a 10, right? Plant can't run. It's a 10. We can't ship orders and we don't have an alternative. It's a 9 or a 10. Then the question is, how likely is it to happen, right? And that may be pretty low, but that's also, we need to understand that, right? We still need to have that in the calculus. And then the one that I think is more important that people don't think about it is, how likely are we to catch this before it happens? And the ones that could jump up and surprise you are the higher ones, right? So then those three multiplied create this RPN number. And then I think the more important piece of it is we just do the prioritization. We filter it nice in a simple Excel table. And then we start saying, what are we going to do about it, right? And I think I've used them at the beginning of a project, and then we typically will also stay with a long project, right? We just finished a greenfield plant in some of the work that we've done. And we checked in on the FMEA typically quarterly, because what we wanted to say, let's get structure in the mitigating actions and get ownership, and in our PMO and our project updates saying, are you progressing on these actions? And have we done what we needed to do to either reduce the possibility of occurrence, reduce the impact if it does occur, or increase our ability to be aware of these things? And have we de-risked the project as we go along? I like that one a lot. And this is another one that I actually didn't have in the article, but as I was getting ready for the webinar, I like this. I've used versions of this, but I've never used this full version. But it's just a 20 questions idea. So it's a little bit of a different approach, and some of it may have some overlap with some of the others, but it gets to be pretty explicit, right? And again, I think this is one that may specifically, really get at the true second order of this, right? Like, who really benefits from this, and who else should we be talking to, right? They may not be involved. Many times these projects are confidential, so that's also a risk to us. We don't have everybody in. And it's just really pushing on some blind spots, right? In the who and the what, and even in the where, right? Where are we going to get at this, right? And then more important for us, it starts to say, where have we done something similar? Or if we have a similar problem, have we had a solution that we need to have ready or bring forward? So I think it's just a very nice, simple step, right? And again, I would tell you, if you gave me an hour on each of these with the right crew, I think we could serve up some very nice thoughts for a leadership team to say, are you comfortable with this? And I think that's probably one of the other things that I would say is, if you're not the leader, if you're part of the team, if you're a sub leader, I think your minimum thing is to make sure that leadership is aware of the risks, right? And I've done these with a business unit, and actually, second to owner, with ownership in the room, to say, we want you to know that we think these are real risks, okay, with this discounting. And they can say, I see the list. I might not like it. I may choose to disagree, and we may say, please, let's wrestle around with that. But when we're done, we want to say, if you're going to make the decision, you need to accept that these exist, and you either need to say, I want this level of mitigation to be comfortable with going along with the decision, or I'm willing to accept it, right? And that's there's that leadership accountability is there, but we just want them to know, okay, and what we think we can do to de-risk the decision and continue to go forward and again have a higher quality outcome. So I think you could do it, and I've done them one-on-one. I mentioned I think you could do them very rapidly, each one of these, and I think you can combine them. So I think for all of these, there's different ways to do it. This is kind of particular for 20 questions, as I went a little bit more deeper into it. I definitely think in a lot of these, some cases you have people who you're a natural devil's advocate. And I have another friend who always used to say he's the conflict miner. You can also see I've got an AI slide here. This poor lady only has 4 fingers. Sorry about that. And then you want to make sure you create the safe environment. And it's not about answering every question. Okay. So now let's dive in and say, what would we do in a specific situation? So I'm going to use a plant closure. It is hypothetical, but I didn't mind it. So let's just say we've got a plant in Columbus, Georgia, and we are going to close it, and we're going to roll the operations into another facility we've got in Tennessee within 12 months. So if we're doing the ripple map, here are some obvious first order effects, right? We've got job loss. We've got a lot of network of both our inbound and outbound to this new plant, right? So we've got new links to our distribution centers and customers we're supplying, and we've got new inbounds, either for existing suppliers, more demand, or repointing suppliers. We got to decide what to do with the equipment, right? Are we selling it all? Is any of it has to be moved? And there's always a transition effect, both, in some time period, there's always an alternate sourcing plan. The challenge with that is, uncertain duration. Okay. And then you got second order effects, right? When we were at Coke and a plant left a geography, we wanted to be very intentional to make sure we were clear. In almost all cases, try to offer other jobs to those employees. We wanted to convey that we were still committed to that community. In most cases, we would still have a distribution center. And we actually, in many cases, wanted to raise the prominence and visibility of that distribution center in some of our community engagement work, because we didn't want to create an unintended, hey, Coke's not committed to this geography, as an example. We want to make sure suppliers involved at the right level, so that that they were involved, that we don't, we include them in the planning process at the right time, so it's a smooth transition. In this example, if you were closing a plant, and in some cases, if you're opening a new plant, when I was at Frito-Lay, when we opened new plants, they usually had the greatest and latest and greatest technology, and they were very competitive, and they would draw demand from other plants. You could have unintended morale issues at other facilities in your network. Hey, is this going to happen to us, or is this going to impact our business? Typically also need a media plan and be prepared in terms of how you're going to deal with that. And in some cases, it's politicians, right? I've been involved in situations globally where a plant might end up staying open because of the political implications of it. And, that's just a reality. And I think, another second order effect is this idea of where's our employee pipeline, right? And we might in Columbus have been really well wired, and are we going to be able to get the kind of technology and capability we need in employees as we're adding capacity to this other facility in Tennessee? And then, long term for us could be other things, right? Yep. And I do see Sean raising your hand, and I appreciate that. And because it's Sean Maroney, Sean, I know you. Sean, Sean McConnell, can we let Sean come off of mute and ask his question?
Love this section. Along with the relationship with local tech schools, we've seen some best practices related to public-private partnerships that are driving supply chain, both through community education as well as everything to construction of curriculum and advising universities in that space. But I also think talent retention for the future, which you mentioned in third order effects, a lot of that has to do with relationship building and maintaining those relationships. So branding your company as you look at your talent pipelines is definitely something that could be impacted by geography. So.
Nope. Thank you, Sean. I appreciate your wisdom, and it's good to hear from you. And it is interesting. I would tell you, again, in our time at Frito and my time at Coke, I don't think we appreciated in our infrastructure side the connection, that in almost every state is interested in economic development in their state. So in the state that's winning, we want to leverage those relationships to help us avoid some of these ripples. And the state where we're decreasing employment, we want to be thoughtful about as well. So I think, again, here, just a nice, simple example of you can walk through this with the right group of people in just a short period of time. So here's an FMEA example, same situation, but definitely, something that you can see, if you're losing experienced workers, and in most cases, in an industrial situation, you move people more than 100 miles, you're going to lose a decent amount of them. And in many cases, you may not be able, just because it's incremental capacity, you may be taking, we saw this a lot when you take a 1-shift operation to a 2-shift operation. That's a heavy lift in a lot. And from 2 to 3 is a much heavier lift. And to have the workforce quality to be able to run your equipment, that can be an issue. We've also seen people, when they've gone from an old facility to a new facility, the technology requires a higher skill level. So it's then, even if you're bringing employees, it's the upskilling. So this one is an example, rises high on the list, and you could see some countermeasures, right? Can we make the case for people to relocate, right? We've seen in automotive industry and others, they are willing to move people a long way, but what are you doing on the training at the receiving facilities probably is as important as anything else, okay? Supplier disruption can be an issue here if you're overloading a supplier that wasn't supporting the existing plant. Clearly, that early communication is most important, but do you think about what the dual sourcing might be? Might be at a cost for a period of time. The employee morale decline I've seen in these type of projects. You've got to have a super aggressive change management strategy, and you've got to have a cadence and a knowable, whether it's monthly or bi-monthly or whatever, super clear ongoing communication with leadership in front of employees, on shift, off shift, equipping supervisors with the right information in order to be able to manage this. Number 3 is a good one. I've been involved in many industrial projects in the US, and probably 9 out of 10 have overrun their budget, and some of them materially. And so our quality of our economic analysis, at least in the industries I've been involved in, is just not great. Granted, we've also seen lots of external factors make that harder, but we've really got to be thoughtful about the scenario planning on what the cost structure should be, and make sure finance can stay with us, right? Not everybody has unlimited capital, and sometimes these are big implications when you go over a capital estimate. And same thing here. You get these wrong in today's social media world, it can hurt, right? And so thinking through all of that, again, having the right stakeholders involved is important. So again, I think if we normally did one of these for this type of project, we might have 30 or 40. So this is not a complete list, but it's just an example of the kind of, the simple thing we would look at. And we've got a kind of hypothetical scores here in terms of what they would look like, but you can clearly move these around. And I would also say, I typically have 3 or 4 people do their version of this, and then you get into a qualitative debate on each of on the severity, the likelihood, and the ability to detect, and that's perfectly fine, right? And you can, whatever your means of getting to a consensus around it. But I think having people wrestle around it is just the part of the exercise of people having conviction that these are legitimate issues. You're going to end up having a top page that looks like this, that says, hey, senior leaders, there are 30 more that we're not going to talk about, but we really think these deserve visibility and they deserve action. Okay. And then I think the pre-mortem, we talked about this one. And I think it's very analogous, to this, the FMEA in this example. And I think, in our world, we can say we did lose customers, right? We might have had some local customers who were really aligned with us, might have been able to promote very aggressively because we were super close to them. Now that we're farther away, we've lost a lot of business with those customers. We found that Nashville was not capable of handling the volume that was there, and our assumption around both their capacity and their costs have not played out, right? And again, having seen this example, there were lots of assumptions. And then for us, we actually changed our process and spent much, much more time on the receiving facility than the facility that was being closed, because we knew that's where the burden would be. Okay. And you can generally say in this type of supply chain example, most plants want volume, but there's a limit, right? And as I said before, when you start moving a plant from 5/2 towards 24/7, nobody gets thrilled about working past Monday through Friday and past first shift. They're just the percentage of population that wants to work second and third shift and wants to work a regular weekend shift is low. And we also know that overtime in this world, and frankly most of my adult life, overtime has its limits for folks. People love overtime when they want it. Okay, I'd love to grab a shift. I'm trying to grab some money for a vacation, but it's another thing when you force them, 4 or 5 weekends in a row. And after one of these, the plans, hey, this is going to be great. We're going to get this new volume. And all of a sudden the plant says, we haven't had a weekend off in 8 weeks. We start losing people, right? So then we could start to say, why did these things happen? And what can we do about this, right? Now that these show up, now we have benefit of this future. What are we going to do to avoid this being a probability, right? Is it realistic for the Tennessee facility to take all the volume? Should we look at spreading this out, or should we have a contingency plan and understand in our business case that third plant to spread the volume might cost us more in freight, might be a higher conversion cost plant, but we at least understand that in the decisioning process. Okay. And I think the idea here is we start doing things like, an early warning, setup, right? So, we know that could happen. And now we want to make sure, like if the plant wasn't ready, or we had to move equipment from one plant to another that's really difficult, we've put that in the plan. Okay. And as we're tracking over the course of things, we know this is a high risk area. Well, we keep an eye on it, right? And we add a bit more focus and a bit more intent. Okay. Same thing's true, on the staffing side of this, right? We'll know early because we're staffing differently, but that may be where, when we want to ramp down the old plant, we want to be thoughtful about the ramp up in the new plant, and nobody wants to pay for it, and it's hard to do in some employment markets, but can you staff up to manage that, right? Well, I don't want to spend that money. Well, what's the risk if you don't? That discussion can at least occur, okay? And I definitely think in this reputation kind of future state, right? This didn't go well. We got a lot of negative press on this. Well, let's make sure that our PR, government affairs folks are with us from day one. They're connected. They're talking to those folks informally and formally to continue to manage that, okay? And this is the scary thing. Like if it was 18 months from now and we had to go back to the board, what would we say to them? And I don't want to go to that meeting. So what are we going to do to avoid that, right? That's kind of the way to think about that. So I think you could do these workshops, as I said, in an afternoon. You could tailor them, for your decision. You could do some pre-work. I think, frankly, these are not hard to facilitate. You could do a little bit more research. We're going to give you all of this. A lot of these tools are available, and curate the groups. Get the right people in the room. Get some contrarians in, but get some people who see the value of doing this to be good supportive partners with you. Get cross-functional team members in. Get the IT folks in, as well as finance, as well as procurement, and as well as commercial folks. Your planners and your logistics people always know the war stories here. So obviously they're going to be with you, and make sure you're just thoughtful around how you document this so that you can have a nice report or outcome to take to your leadership. and then, get some agreement. Even if we get to yes, and we do all these things, that this is part of the implementation planning process, that we keep an eye on it. Okay. Now, I held out the 20 questions one just because it's a little bit different, but I like it. And so we just kind of say, as we kind of wrap this up, let's think about this, right? Back to the 20 questions. Who benefits? Obviously, the Nashville plant might like it, or whoever the leader over that plant is, they're getting more volume, right? Then we could start to say, who in Columbus has the greatest risks that are out there? Who do we really need to keep in mind? Like we've had plenty of plants where we were like, this plant has a unique situation with these customers that's exhibited over time, where they get just-in-time service because they're in the same market. Well, are we going to be able to manage that? That's a key question for us. Are we going to maintain that exception that almost always exists in somewhere, that we've got some expedited service due to proximity? Well, how are we going to fix that, right? And then who else do we need to know about, right? That plant may have been super great in the community, and do we at least need to have a mitigation plan, or is there anybody there who actually needs some consideration in the decision, right? Same thing in terms of risks, omissions, and the what. I think you got to look at workforce in every decision that impacts the physical supply chain, because workforce, frankly, is fragile in almost all situations, right? And then I think we're missing a lot. This upskilling is a big challenge in a lot of people-related or facility-related decisions that I've seen. The supplier realignment, you're confidential, so you're always thinking at the last minute, when can I get to these employees, and when can I let suppliers know? That's a risk. And so you could start to say, how much time would I really need, and how much time are we allowing? What's the disconnect there, right? And I definitely think these alternative scenarios, right? They may be lower cost, higher cost. They may be more difficult, but if you can at least say, we're going to eventually get to full bright, but we're going to invest in the first 3, 6, 9, 12 months post change with a more phased process. Okay. We might spread the production load out. That cost is not in the 10-year, net of benefits. So your NPV is still going to be pretty good, but we just invest here. And I always like to kind of, talk about the do nothing, right? Like, what if we didn't do this? What if we waited? Do we have any luxury of waiting here? Okay. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And then the why of this, what's the real why on this? And I think, what drove us to this, right? Let's just think through the strategic fit. And this may be, in this day and age, this may be, one that doesn't get you a lot, but you still want to make sure you're thinking about all of that. And then I think as we go forward, let's make sure we use lessons learned, right? Whether it's your own company or elsewhere, like who else has dealt with this? I want to read somebody else's pot, okay? And then where are the roadblocks, right? I will tell you, in a lot of these things, regulatory is a time area that you got to be super careful about. Do you understand it? Are you in a new geography? But are there operational culture things that we need to talk about? And raise your hand if you've been on a project where you were over promising. You're like, gosh, I think we're way in the optimistic side of this. We ultimately changed our business cases where we had a nominal business case, a pessimistic, and an optimistic, and we anchored our teams in the middle. Don't sit there and lean on this super optimistic outcome, both on cost and time, right? The engineers are always pressed to do things, in half as much time, when we know every supplier in the country is behind, this raw material is at risk, on and on and on. Over the last few years, we've seen that. Okay. And then I think the when piece is important, is kind of like, back to how do we use, if you've got a PMO process or a project check-in, to really make sure that you're asking these questions, or getting 15 minutes to check in at every one of those. Okay. And then I think the last piece for us is, let's make sure we're validating, what we've done here, right? Are we making sure that we're solving the right problem, right? How do we make sure that bias is not influencing what we're trying to do? And then this validation in this example, if it's Nashville, if it's a software tool, how do we validate this, that we can really handle this? Okay. And then, lot of tendency to underinvest in change and communication. Let's get serious about it. Let's train our own teams in change management. Let's have a dedicated communication resource. And then let's make sure we understand how this really impacts all the larger objectives for the firm. Okay. So again, go through these quickly. I think you can do it. I said in the article, this is my point of view, and not even really SCL's, because I wrote this. But I do say other people think about this. And if you know me, I love Atul Gawande. He is super big on that extra question. Ask one more question in his book, Better, which we recommend. It's not a supply chain book, but it's great for supply chain people. He's a checklist manifesto guy. Very rigorous around those processes. So I like him a lot. But these are other people out there, and they come from different fields who are very much about how do you think about, improving the quality of your decision making and making sure that you're driving resiliency into your decisions. Okay. So you can go read these folks, but I think this is an area that, as I said before, super timely as we see decisions being made at large. We're like, did people really understand that this could happen? Right. And so you can make an impact here. So there it is. Your role as a leader, right? Wherever you are. Okay. If you're a team member or whoever, you could say, hey, are we going to do any of this? If you have influence, say, hey, I've got some simple tools. Maybe you'd like to take a look at them. Maybe we could use them. And I think we could invest a small amount of time and really help improve the culture of decision making in our company. So make space for this. I think it's always good to be a questioner, right? I always love Socratic learning, but in a positive way, right? We're not trying to impact other people and say they're not doing what they're supposed to do, but just improve the quality of what we're doing. And then think of the larger stakeholders, right? I always say, go to your consumer, go to your customer, go to your shareholder. And in the supply chain world, think about our suppliers, right? So it's just some simple things here, and then kind of defining success. What would this project really look like in 2 years if we hit it? And then what can we do to make sure we have the highest probability of getting there? So I think the kind of the closure pieces for us is make sure they're checkpoints for this. Make sure that this gets some space, that the consequences are, there's a page in the deck, right? Encourage teams that bring the risk forward. That's what Steve Kaling did for me in the WMS. He was like, Chris, good news is we're not going to fire you. The bad news is you have to tell this story like 5 times about how you guys screwed this up. And I'm like, that's great. I'll own it. But he was positive, and I now think very positively about that experience, and maybe some folks on the call remember that. And then we all want to be adult learners, continuous learners, use these, pre-mortems, but also still do the post-mortem. Okay. So not rocket science here. And I think somebody asked in the chat, as always, you're going to get the deck as well as the video link. And I think, my final thoughts are, what's the project you're working on right now? Okay. That deserves an hour of this, or 2 or 3 hours. And that's probably the action for you. And I always say, we're at Georgia Tech, we're in the business of helping people. And if there's something here that you saw that you're like, gosh, could you come speak to our team or whatever? We'd love to get that request, right? We find a way to say yes, usually on the house. But this is the kind of thing where we're just trying, I'm big on overall supply chain competitiveness. And I think this is one of the areas that is, so many of those areas are really hard to control, but I think decision quality is something that we can do a lot about. So hopefully there's something here that you liked and can take away and apply with your teams. So as always, we do this with our marketing at the end. You get the cool stuff at the front, but we do remind you that we've got courses coming up. And actually our risk and resilience course in October hits this right on the head. And if you've got interest in that, we got time, it's beyond the summer. We could hit that one. I will always hype our machine learning course, really popular, really successful. If you don't have time for an online master's, this is part of our overall supply chain analytics certificate. Still very, very popular and very impactful for the folks who are taking it. And then we're doing our procurement series in a compact section, both live if you want to go on vacation to Savannah, Georgia, or you happen to be in that market, and virtual. So you can catch those 3 courses literally within a week. And those are not just for procurement folks, right? Almost everybody in supply chain is dealing with some aspect of negotiation, stakeholder influence, and in many cases are on one side or the other of a contract. And truthfully, you're managing a category in many cases if you're dealing with suppliers of one form or another from an operational standpoint. So that's my plug for those courses. What I will also remind you is that we do custom as well. We do versions of all the courses that we offer, and we'll mix and match them and we'll tailor them. And I just think this is interesting because these are examples of the courses that we've done or have in progress this year. Just finished a very nice tailored offering on IBP. It evolves, even though it's a 20-year-old practice, it's still not fully evolved. I think we're delivering a really nice course. We've done it 2 times, I think, in private over the last year or two on facility design and optimization. And we've got, some of the leading faculty in the world who are exceptional in front of an industry audience doing that class. We've got work coming right out of our research base, and we're doing a modern supply chain leadership course for a firm that's basically transformed their supply chain strategy. And so we want to equip their people to do it. And then we do, we do classic, hardcore sales and ops planning for folks who are still in that mode. And we had a very nice session of that early this year. So that's the kind of flavor of things that we've got out there. Private's not bad for us. You'd be shocked. It's not, not super expensive. We can do it for an audience as small as 10. We could do them online, face-to-face, hybrid. One of the ones we're doing in the fall is like, 6 consecutive Wednesday afternoons, like noon to 3. It's for multiple time zones because people, can't be consumed with that. But we'll do it however you want. We will customize it. As I said before, super flexible. If certification is important, we can do that for you. So if you got any interest in that, let us know. Okay. I think the next lunch and learn will be great. Dima Nazal, who is actually going to teach one of the courses we've got upcoming that I just mentioned, is really one of our true rock star faculty, and really is wonderful with industry. She's done great work in applied research. She leads our senior design, but she is a leader in facility design and optimization, but is actually just taken on a leadership role in our health and humanitarian supply chain center. And she and I are going to talk about, hey, what are you prepared for what could come next? We're getting ready to get into hurricane season. Who knows what's coming? So that one, even if you're on vacation, sign up because you'll get the video afterwards. But if you're getting ready for your holiday and want to grab that lunch and learn, we definitely would like you to join us, and we want you to share. We had a nice sign up crowd. We had over 40 in the chat, and we had, I think, close to 100 sign up. So we're thrilled to have you with us. All right, Joan, I appreciate the thank you. If you're jumping out, we appreciate it. Holler at us. Yeah. We will send the link for the next lunch and learn, I think, when we send out the YouTube for this one and the slides as well. So no worries on that.
Along with that, you'll also get a link to the newsletter that you can sign up for. That way you won't miss any of the articles that come out from SEL. You won't miss any of the lunch and learns, anything like that. So I highly recommend signing up for the newsletter so you don't miss any of these insights.
Yep. Yeah. And I say, if there's one more person you say, I know someone who would like this, just send it on to them, right? We're not trying to solve world hunger here, but if there's any of this that would be helpful for folks, just send it on, right? This one's free and easy. So we appreciate it. Jeff Turney, thanks. I saw you out there. I appreciate it. As always, Jeff, you've lived some of these with me, so I know you probably got a few chuckles and head nods on that. Superb. Anybody else in the comments? We'll go once, go twice. And as I said before, if we can help you, let us know, right? Reach out. I know Sean and Andy put up in the chat. Just send us a note at info@scl.gatech.edu, and we'd be thrilled to see if we can help you with whatever you're working on. All right. I think we've run them out of gas. We'll give you 5 minutes back. And for those watching later and online, we appreciate it. As I said before, once you see this on YouTube, share it with a friend. Thanks for the hand clap. And as always, we appreciate your engagement with Georgia Tech, our Supply Chain Logistics Institute, and we look forward to having you join us same bad time, same bad channel 4 weeks from now. All right, y'all take care.